Okay. Welcome once again to Thursdays on the Stoop, getting started in literary translation. Today we have three panelists from the Transversal collective, Sean Gasper Bye, Marianna Suleymanova, and Emily Hunsberger. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Sean to get us started. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much to Blue Stoop for hosting us. This is our first time doing this collaboration with Blue Stoop. It's our first time. I think I'm right in saying it's Transversal's first time doing a public event like this. So huge thank you to all of you for coming out on a Thursday afternoon, and a big thanks to Emily, who did so much of the legwork to pull all of this together. Um, so my name's Sean Gasper Bye. I'm a literary translator from Polish, and I'm also one of the directors of the American Literary Translators Association. We're the only national organization in the United States that only supports the work of literary translators. That's our whole purpose in existence. I've been a literary translator for about 10 years, and I'm based here in Philadelphia. I'm one of the members of Transversal. We're going to be hearing today from Emily Hunsberger and Marianna Suleymanova, who are two emerging or early career translators based here in the region. And they're going to be sharing some of their experience with us as early career translators, some of the work that they're doing at the moment, and we're going to get a little peek behind the curtain into the work of a literary translator, the kind of things that you're thinking about working with literary texts as a translator, the kinds of issues that you're coming up against. And we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience as well, so you'll be able to take part as well. Just to introduce our two panelists, Marianna Suleymanova is a translator of Russian language literature, originally from Tashkent in Uzbekistan and now based in the Philly area. She focuses on anti-war, feminist, queer, and other dissident voices. She's the winner of the 2024 Words Without Borders Momentum Grant, and has translations out and forthcoming from the Washington Square Review, The Offing, and a whole bunch of other places. And if you go and Google her, you can find some of her wonderful work. Emily Hunsberger translates Spanish language literature from across the Americas, including the United States. Her translation of Wonderland, Chronicas of Belonging in America, is out from Mouthfeel Press. And Emily, I very foolishly left your author's name out of this bio. Could you tell us what the author's name is, please?
Yes, that book is by Melanie Marquez Adams.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Uh, Her other work, Emily's other work, can be read in Latin American Literature Today, the Southern Review, and elsewhere. And she has a professional background in immigrant rights, international sustainable development, and in education. Thank you both so much for being with me here today. I'm really curious to learn more about your experience as early career translators. I think that literary translation is something that maybe a lot of people think about, but sort of don't know how to get started, don't know where to get started. What was the big factor for you that helped you go from thinking about doing literary translation to actually doing it?
I'm happy to answer first if you're cool with that, Mars. Yeah. So I will say nearly 20 years passed in my case from my introduction to literary translation as a practice and a craft that I might potentially be able to do to actually earnestly pursuing it. And just a couple notes along the way, when I was in high school, and I grew up in South Florida, I took a world literature class, and we never knew the names of any of the translators of any of the works. We didn't talk about translation when we were discussing these works. But then as an undergraduate, I have my bachelor's and master's in Spanish, and there's a lot of literature studies, and I took a translation course. And that's when I thought, oh wow, I really enjoy literary translation. but I didn't pursue that until, like I said, almost 2 decades later. And really, it was during the pandemic because I had a kind of carpe diem attitude. I had always postponed some of these pursuits like for a better time. And then I thought, well, what is a better time but now? And I took a 2 week literary translation workshop that was online through the Kenyon Review. Sadly, I don't think they offer that specific workshop anymore, but that really helped me just, be in a peer setting, learn more about the practice of translation, as well as not just having a text and getting it into English, but also about literary magazines and publishing, for a lot of people here who might be writers already or know about the publishing world, kind of that connection with, I'm creating this translation. How do I get it into a place where other people can read it? Because, often we love a text or really want to advocate for more people to be exposed to an author's work. And how do you do that? How do you bridge between working with the text and getting people to see that? So that's really, that Kenyon Review workshop was really what took this, kind of long brewing, simmering aspiration of mine and really launched me into actually earnestly pursuing literary translation.
All right. I've been a translator in the commercial realm pretty much my entire career, but I'd always thought that it was kind of a frivolous pursuit to translate literature until the Ukraine war started, and I started volunteering for this anti-war magazine, translating poetry and diary entries and prose to bring just more nuance to the conversation, because the way that everything was being covered was not very nuanced. So that was one thing where I was like, okay, I can actually use my skills for something and not just, this is my creative outlet. And then another thing I did is I took a workshop through Alta, to which I brought one page. It was with Marianna Schwartz, who translates from Russian. And she had asked me where I've published before, and I said, nowhere, I've never submitted anything. And she kind of shamed me quite a bit for it and had me give her a call right after the workshop. And that's how I sort of started pitching things, whether to magazines, and then eventually found my first book, and now I have 3 books.
That's amazing. Lars, a question I have for you is that you grew up as a Russian speaker, and I'm curious how you thought about the decision to be translating from Russian into English. I know that this is something we talk a lot about in the translation community, that heritage speakers are not always necessarily encouraged to become literary translators out of their native language and into English. Was that something that you thought about at all? Was it something you had any concerns about? Or was it something where you felt like, hey, this is my superpower, that I know these 2 languages completely perfectly?
Yeah, I think for me, the way that I'm wired, the more I am discouraged from something, the more I want to do it. That's just the feature of my personality. But also, I think I can feel Russian in my bones, and I think that does make me better at transmitting the vibes than a lot of people that can't feel it as much. And also, the things I translate are from people in my generation, pretty much. So it's a world I entirely understand on multiple levels. And I know there's plenty of stigma about being a heritage speaker and translating from your native language, but I kind of love it. I do think it's a superpower. I know it's not always seen as such.
It makes me really glad that this is an experience, sort of a background that we're becoming more open to in the translation community. I work from a language that's very rarely taught as a second language. I'm not a native speaker of Polish. I learned it as a second language. But if we want to have access to literature from so many parts of the world, it's going to need to be translated by native speakers of those languages, and they're not always going to be native speakers of English. And so I think learning how to appreciate that kind of work and how to support translators who haven't formally studied their source languages necessarily, right, or have maybe learned it at the kitchen table with their families. I think this is so important. I totally identify with what you said about Marian. I got into the field by having an older, more experienced translator kind of take me under her wing. having somebody able to vouch for me like that and say, hey, he does actually know what he's doing, was really valuable. I think this field, like so many others in literature, is based around networks and personal connections and things like that, and that can be really intimidating early on in a career. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do with Transversal, right? Is to have these like peer networks of support so that we can help open those doors for one another. Um, I wanted to ask you both, what do you feel like are some of the more rewarding and some of the more frustrating things about the stage of literary translation that you're at right now?
Go ahead, Emily.
Um, uh, I mean, I jotted down some notes in both of these categories, but I think for me, mostly it's rewarding because I also am a commercial translator and I've been doing that for 11 years. And I've done a lot of other types of work in multilingual workplaces and just environments. So this is really like my, like my passion project and where I get to like tap into my creativity. So it's really rewarding, and I feel the freedom to experiment and play around with different texts and translation approaches. And I also translate from different genres like nonfiction and fiction and poetry, and I find poetry really kind of exhilarating because it's so difficult. And similarly to you, Mars, if somebody says something's untranslatable, I'm like, well, we'll find something to do with it. Yeah, and I've experimented with co-translating with friends, which I think also is another really cool scenario for like what you were mentioning, Sean, where we have, two people with different heritage connections or experiences in terms of education and like where each language kind of lives in their body, in their mind and heart, and then they can work together. So I think that's a really cool thing. I also have studied and used Portuguese in the workplace, like talking about budget spreadsheets, but I've always been kind of afraid to do literary translation from Portuguese. But a Brazilian, native Brazilian translator, Bruna Dantas Lovato, she's encouraged, she said, just, translate something, just try. So I think it's just being in this kind of, where I don't have this pressure, like I'm an unknown, so I can just play and enjoy the craft. And, on the flip side, you do want to eventually get your work out there and have other humans interact with it. And so there's a lot of, like with any type of literary pursuit, there's a lot of submitting, a lot of getting used to rejection. And I also think with translation, I do have some peers that are going to international book fairs and they have connections with authors and literary communities overseas. And when I come across works, usually it's like it's already really popular, already been translated. So I just kind of focus on the few authors that I have developed relationships with, and am kind of just I like I said, yes, it's a little bit of a frustration, but mostly for me, it's really rewarding.
I think what's most rewarding for me about it is the kind of a curatorial aspect of it. Like I get to choose what to bring and show to more people, my friends, people I love here, or a new perspective that maybe isn't present on the bookshelves in America yet. And that's wonderful. Another thing is that I work with anti-war authors right now. A lot of them live in exile, but one doesn't. One doesn't, and it's quite unsafe for her. She gets a lot of death threats and other threats, and she's used my translations to apply for residencies elsewhere. And I can't imagine anything more rewarding than getting somebody out of harm's way, potentially. And that's really great. What's frustrating, things move really slowly in this industry. You may feel like you've worked every day for a year, and out of 40 emails, you've got one response. That is a normal rhythm of it. So what I have to do sometimes is just write down how many things have happened, and then I'm like, oh, okay, things are actually happening, just not not as instantly as I would like. So yeah, that would
Yeah.
be.
And I think unfortunately it stays that way. That's definitely still my experience as well. Em, I wanted to ask you because you just recently had your first book out, which is, you know, huge congratulations. This is one of the like the big thresholds in the literary translation world. Um, there's a bunch of sort of resources that open up to folks once you have your first book length translation. You can join the Authors Guild. There's certain residencies that open up and things like that. So it's this big hurdle that everyone is sort of trying to get over. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like getting that work to publication? How did it happen?
I feel like I have to say that Melanie Marcus Adams is here with us today because it would be strange to be talking about her in the third person without acknowledging her. So, hey, Mel. And I again, I'm going to travel back in time a little bit because my relationship with Melanie, we've actually done a lot of different things together. And separately, apart from getting into literary translation, from even a young age, growing up in South Florida, and just throughout my whole professional career, I've just always kind of had this perspective that even when I was studying literature in college, I'm like, you know, the United States is a Spanish-speaking country. Why aren't we talking about the Spanish in the U.S. and the roughly 40 million people who speak Spanish at home, which is kind of our statistical reference for, you know, people being a native or heritage speaker. And when I got connected with Melanie, it made a lot of sense, but I had never explored or discovered this until, you know, she shared with me that there's a whole ecosystem of writers in the US writing in Spanish, many of them as an act of resistance, and that there's literary magazines specifically publishing the work of this community of writers and presses and you know, book fairs, things like that. And so we actually had done a couple of other things together, including curating a podcast series of 10 short readings by 10 other writers who are based in the US writing in Spanish before really, you know, we had some momentum in terms of Melanie's work that I was translating. And Melanie writes fiction and nonfiction. And some of her crónicas, which, you know, are kind of a form of essay or creative nonfiction, we had published in literary magazines. But it was really also Melanie's relationship with Mouthfeel Press that published Wonderland. And I'm going to do the thing where I hold up the book. This publisher, Mouthfeel Press, is a bilingual publisher, and they were already working with Melanie on publishing her most recent collection of short stories, short fiction called Amphibias. And so it was kind of through this relationship that she and I had already developed, and she had this connection with this publisher and brought this up, and we had already published a few literary magazines. So it was really kind of, you know, concentric circles until we both really worked together to bring this book to life. So yeah, I have her to thank, but she always reminds me, you know, that we've been really doing a lot together leading up to this. So, and I also have to shout out to Martia Maloney, who's the editor at Mouthfeel Press, because this was the first time that she worked with a translator. And, you know, there's a lot of resources that we may not have time to get to today, but one of them is a translation contract template through the Authors Guild. And she basically adopted all of these things to include the translator as well as the author. So it was a really, really cool experience. So I also just want to, you know, lift up Mouthfeel Press for treating translators well.
Thank you for that. And I love how that highlights the really collaborative nature of translation. I feel like it can sometimes feel like we're just kind of locked up in our rooms by ourselves with our like computers and our dictionaries. But my experience has definitely been of working really closely with authors, of building these personal relationships with them, and then collaborating very closely with editors who, as you say, there's not that many. Proportionally speaking, there's very few literary translations that are published in this country, actually. And so some of it is finding an editor who has that sense of adventure, is willing to take a little risk, and is willing to get outside of their comfort zone and go on this journey with you. So thank you for sharing that. We have literally a couple of minutes before we're going to move on to the readings. We wanted to talk a little about the tools that translators use to hone our craft and to grow. I was wondering if each of you could talk about, maybe do you have like one favorite tool that you use, or one thing that you feel like really kind of unlocks something special for you?
Sure, I can start. I think in terms of editing, really reading it out loud helps. Reading it out loud and seeing where it doesn't feel right. It feels silly to do, but it has helped me tremendously. Like at the ending stages, workshopping also helps if you have access to that. There are plenty of workshops through Alta, and sometimes magazines will do them. But I don't call anything even a semi-final draft unless I've read it out loud and didn't stumble anywhere.
I second that, reading out loud, especially because with any literary work, even if it's not poetry or poetic per se, just the rhythm and the feeling, you wanna get that where you want it. And I was thinking today, like literary translation, it's whatever your text is that you're coming up with, it's something that's translated, but it's also something that's written. So any of the tools that apply to writing, letting it breathe, taking a break, coming back to it. Also joining ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, I was given advice by the great Kate Hadeen, who's one of the leaders of that Can You Review workshop. You should really join ALTA, and participating in multilingual workshops, being in community with other translators, like with Transversal here in Philly. And in a way, everything I've ever translated is a weensy bit of co-translation, because, none of us, well, okay, I shouldn't say none of us, but most good translators would not claim to know everything by any means, especially because there's so much references and specific things that come up depending on what an author has written. So, just asking friends, asking references if you're really stuck on things. I've had people in workshops point out something that I totally got wrong. And also reading translated works, translating different types of text that sometimes unlocks some freedoms that I wasn't allowing myself, and another type of text that I'll go back. So I think it's just really just staying in motion. Like it doesn't matter so much the exact tool, but just, kind of, even if you're just like treading water a little bit, but like stay reading, stay writing, stay practicing, and usually you'll just like stumble upon something new that will help you.
Yeah, thank you both. One of my favorite things to do is to sort of read around the text that I'm working on. So whether it's reading other authors in Polish who work in a similar genre, or who are sort of, from a similar generation, I find that often helps me pin down what's interesting in particular about the voice or the style of the author who I'm working with. And then reading books in English that remind me of the book that I'm reading in Polish, or if my author tells me that they have particular literary inspirations who write in English, getting a sense of just the words that those authors use, or the frameworks of sentences that they use. I'm also a total grammar nerd, and I love using translation as a way of like not only learning about Polish grammar and vocabulary and other things, but about English. I feel like my knowledge of the English language has really been deepened by trying to figure out how to bend it into these shapes to get it to do things that the Polish is doing, and vice versa, right? You learn not just what Polish can do that English can't, but also what English can do that Polish can't, and you start looking for opportunities to use those. Amazing. Thank you both so much. It's always such a joy to talk to the two of you. So we're going to move on to a couple of readings. And to do this, I am going to share my screen so that we can see these texts that we're going to be hearing from. And now comes that awkward moment where I find the right button to click on. Here we go. Okay. Da, da, da. Is that up? Can everyone see that?
I think it's doing that thing where it cooks for a few seconds before
Oh,
it appears.
it's cooking.
There you
Okay.
go. It's coming up. It's loading.
Okay.
There we go.
Are we there? Okay. Awesome. So we're going to start with Mars.
So should I read one a little in Russian first before I?
Yeah. Give us a couple sentences in Russian first, so we can hear it.
Мордовский крест. Черная. В каком районе детей украла? Здесь, на вокзале? У Кати были большие темно-карие глаза, черные плотные волосы по плечи, черные ресницы, черные брови, маленькие черные усики над губой и черные негустые волосы по ногам и рукам. Не русская. Не понимаешь, что ли, русского языка? Then I'll switch to English. Mordovian Cross. Hey, dark lady, where'd you get those kids? You grab them here at the train station? Katya had large, dark brown eyes, thick black hair down to her shoulders, black eyelashes, black eyebrows, tiny black mustache over her upper lip, and sparse black hairs on her arms and legs. I'm talking to you, Jippo. Do you not speak Russian? After the circus, Katya bought kids clouds of cotton candy. Their heads disappeared on them. It took Katya a long time to wash the twins' faces over the bathroom sink, and they stood in the bathroom line for a while before that. One tried to use the sketchy men's room, but Katya stopped him. Then he saw a stand selling mechanical lions in the lobby and began to wail. A new officer came on duty. He also asked Katya for her name, last name, place, and date of birth. He hadn't used any slurs yet. Katya wearily repeated that her name was Ekaterina Ivanova, maiden name Pakosova. He chuckled in a theatrical manner more reminiscent of actors on TV than real people. Katya told him that she was from Penza but lived in the Moscow suburbs. She gave him her address. The new cop promptly remarked on the color of Katya's skin and asked her who she gypped the kids from. Once again, Katya stated that the children were hers, gave their names and date of birth. The first cop returned from a smoke break and wasted no time calling Katya a vagrant bitch.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about working on this text, Mars. Should I keep the slides up or should I, what do you think? Would you rather
You could
have
go
them
to
up?
the previous one, maybe.
Yeah.
So this was the first story I translated from the first book I ever worked on. And this story had me losing sleep because it is about racism against people of Romani descent in Russia. But all the terms used as insults in the story are skin-colored insults, which here would mean something entirely different. And I wanted to situate the story in Russia still and wanted to make it about, I wanted the oppressed group to remain the oppressed group. So I had to essentially, in the first line here, opt for a Shakespearean dark lady, because all the other terms were offensive and would encompass different populations here. And I had to, non-Russian being used as an insult also doesn't work here. I doubt an American would feel that's an insult. So I had
You're right,
to.
right. He calls her Neruskaya, like
Yeah.
non-Russian woman, literally. Yeah.
So I had to leave certain skin tone mentions just to highlight how she's a little different visually from the Slavs, essentially. But also I had to really dig into like stereotypes about Romani people and the things that they hear, because I didn't want the story to lose its punch, to lose teeth. So I had to make the insults kind of specific, but without having them encompass anybody else or anybody they shouldn't. So that it took me weeks. I took this to workshops. People told me to use all kinds of terms that I wasn't okay using. And I think in the beginning, why this is interesting too, as somebody just starting out, you really want to do that one-to-one translation. But not only is it often impossible, it's often wrong. And you can see here, even without knowledge of Russian, there are stars on the left, there are no stars on the right. This is very far from one-to-one. But what you want to focus on translating is vibes and impact. And I'm sure another translator maybe would have made that story about something different. Maybe they would have situated it more in what happens in America. I wanted to kind of keep the problem specifically. So that was like kind of an ideological challenge on top of a linguistic one, which good luck to AI with handling a text.
Yeah, I loved what you said about vibes and impact. I often talk about how you're trying to convey meaning, you're trying to convey form, and you're trying to replicate the experience that a reader has reading the original. And that's the vibes, that's the like intangible stuff, and where it really complicates that that one-to-one, like you were talking about. We have some time here for some questions for Mars. If anybody in the audience has anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and raise your little digital hand. I can't quite see everybody, I think, while I have my presentation open, but maybe Mars and Emily, if you can, maybe you could help me call on people if they've got any questions.
Or maybe folks can even just open their mic and...
Yeah, that's fine too. Just feel free to hop in. Yeah, I see a question from David.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Very interesting conversation and information. What is the current thought in the field of one translating one's own work? I know that traditionally many translators work very closely with the writer or the poet to ensure that the work is reflective of the author's intentions. And I'm wondering, what are the current thoughts in the field about that?
Mars or Emily, is that something either of you have had experience with, or do you know folks who have been translating their own work?
No.
Well, again, I don't want to speak for Melanie because she is joining us here in this workshop. And Melanie also, I will say, in addition to being a writer, is a translator into Spanish. And she has self-translated some of her own work. And we, have kind of talked about, the choice to have someone else do the translation. And I couldn't really speak to what if there's some kind of consensus or, public debate about this in the literary translation world in general, but I can just speak to the specific experience, I guess. And I think in the context of Spanish in the US, there's a lot of self-interpretation and self-translation. However, literally or figuratively, you want to think about that concept for people having an immigrant experience, like speaking Spanish in the US. So me being the translator in a way kind of relieves the author from having to constantly be translating herself and interpreting herself. But at the same time, because she is fully bilingual and could fully write in English if she chose, we did work closely together on editing my translations and, sometimes she had choices that she wanted to make in the English that wouldn't have been like a direct thing I could have ascertained from the original text, but we talked about it. So, I think it's a valid choice, but I also think that, there's things to be gained and enriched from having, another person translate your work as well. So, I don't think there's like a right or wrong answer, like, someone is gonna like snub you from the literary translation world, but I think it's just more, more options to be explored, which is, maybe kind of a very open-ended answer that brings more questions than responses. But yeah, that's what I would add from like, this one specific experience.
Mm. There's an interesting case of the translator Jennifer Croft, who works from Spanish and Polish, and she wrote a memoir, which in English is called Homesick. She wrote it in Spanish first, and then translated it herself into English, and really rewrote the book very substantially as she was translating it into English, because she found that English was just doing different things, and with a different readership, there were different things that she wanted to emphasize. It was also a few years later she found that she had sort of changed as a writer in some respects. I think that's one of the cool things about translating your own work, is that you can really make it two different live versions of the same text as from one another. Yeah. I see a question from Travis.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I had a question for Mars based on this passage and what you said about vibes and impact, which I really like as a framework for thinking about translation. And I would imagine that if you're going for vibes and impact, it could at times take you pretty far afield from the original text. And I'm just curious, do you have any sort of rules for yourself or informal guidelines about like, oh, I've strayed maybe a little too far and I want to bring it back? Or how do you kind of make that judgment call when you're pursuing vibes and impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think my first instinct is to jump as far as I can away from the original. You try to work within the constraints of the original, and then if those are not enough, you have to kick them down a little bit and see if that clicks together. And it's sort of reading it out loud, sleeping on it, revising. I mean, I think I was taking like a poetry workshop once, poetry and translation with Boris Dralyuk. And he was like, if you can't be funny in that line, like just be funny somewhere else. And to me, then that like blew my mind. I was like, what do you mean somewhere else? Like I have to be funny right here in this here moment. But it's sort of like that. You try with what you have, and then if it doesn't work, you push it a little bit. And then, yeah, you have people read it, you reread it yourself. So I don't just go for the most extreme divorce from the original text. It's very gradual and long and painful sometimes.
Great, thank you.
There's definitely a funny little neurotic accounting system you start doing as a translator.
Yes, yeah. I definitely have done that. If I can't do it here, I'll do it somewhere else. And it's like you're trying to get the whole thing in the right kind of balance. Amazing. Thank you for those great questions. Let's go to, if I can get the slides to move along. Let's hear a little from Wonderland. And yeah, same deal. If you want to read a little bit in the Spanish first and then switch over to the English.
Sounds good. So I'll just say again, Wonderland, Crónicas of Belonging in America is a collection of crónicas. So the reading I'm going to do today is from one that is called The Ghost of the South. The original title in Spanish is Una leyenda del sur. And yeah, I'll just read a couple sentences in Spanish and then go to the translation. Una leyenda del sur. Dicen que por los lujosos pasillos del Hotel Opryland en Nashville, Tennessee, pena una mujer fantasma conocida como Lady in Black. Quienes se han encontrado con ella cuentan que es de aspecto más bien terrorífico y que el vestido negro vaporoso que lleva encaja a la perfección con su estilo gótico sureño. Los empleados del hotel aseguran que no hay que tenerle miedo, que ella se contenta con observar a los huéspedes y a los turistas que recorren el icónico lugar atraídos por sus fuentes y jardines exuberantes. They say that the halls of the palatial Opryland Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee, are haunted by the ghost of a woman known as the Lady in Black. Those who have seen her maintain that this bone-chilling apparition dons a gauzy black dress, a perfect specimen of Southern Gothic style. The hotel staff assures their guests that the ghost is not to be feared, as she's content to simply observe the droves of tourists flocking to the hotel's opulent fountains and gardens. Farther below on the same continent, or on a different one, depending on the country where you learn geography, stories are whispered about a similar specter, with the exception that this ghost doesn't settle for merely observing the living. She has a much more traditional approach to her occupation, and in her prime she took great pleasure in terrorizing the streets of Guayaquil. She's known as the Dama Tapada, a lady ghost who first began haunting Ecuador's largest city in the 1700s. Nearly every version of the legend of the Dama Tapada describes her as a slender woman. When it comes to female spirits, their figures are almost always described as slender, with a dark veil covering her face. They say the Dama would begin her ghoulish labors at the stroke of midnight, setting out to seduce and entrap unsuspecting gentlemen leaving the city's taverns. At that hour, the gaslight lamps would cast a sinister glow onto the cobblestone streets, the perfect setting for a manhunt. The poor drunken fellows lacked any self-control when faced with the seductive guile of a beautiful woman, and they would follow her down dark passageways and back alleys as if in a trance. Once she had cornered her prey, the Dama Tapada would slowly lift the veil to reveal her face, a splendidly putrescent skull. As in any good ghost story, the men either dropped dead from a heart attack after the terrifying encounter, or they would be forever marked by an indelible trauma, but not without the consolation prize of a hair-raising anecdote to frighten and impress their future grandchildren. Just imagine for a moment the panic that ensued as word spread about the hauntings. Cuidadito, señores, this too could be your fate if you don't go straight home after work. Yet it seems the Dama Tapada grew tired of the streets of Guayaquil, and she was no longer seen in the port city. Sightings were reported sporadically in other parts of Ecuador and neighboring countries, but after a time, poof! Clearly a spirit that found such pleasure in haunting the land of the living wouldn't just decide to vanish at the drop of a hat. It makes no sense. On the contrary, the explanation may be far more simple. Like so many of us, perhaps the restless Dama decided to go north. You want me to just say a little bit about it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I think this actually might be the first Crónica of Melanie's that I ever translated, if I remember correctly. And it's really interesting because she's connecting these two kind of ghost stories from Guayaquil and Nashville, and weaving, and further on in the text kind of talks about the history of both of the cities. So it has this definitely journalistic element of the Crónica as a form, but also, the main conceit of the story is that the Dama Tapada immigrated to the United States, changed her name and her, so it's also, bringing in this kind of perspective of the immigrant experience. And, one of the things that's like really basic that I just wanted to talk about that I had even forgotten was something that I had, to really think about was, what do I do with the proper name, Dama Tapada? Because I could have translated that into English, but again, I wanted to place that. And, again, like I was saying with the whole conceit, there's even a part in the Crónica where she changes her name, and that's, part of the thing. And she doesn't just do a literal translation like the veiled lady, but she becomes the lady in black. So she also can reinvent herself, so even something that may seem straightforward when you're reading like the finished product here, you have to, there's always choices, right? There's options. and decisions to make, and many of them could be valid, and you have to just, decide what fits with your vision. And again, like you're saying, Sean, I always say the same thing. You're trying to recreate the experience of the text, and my experience of this text is what means that my translation will be different than someone else's, because I'm recreating what I experienced when I read the original.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Does anybody have any questions for Emily? Raise your hands or hop right in, or any general questions as well. Those are also welcome. If not, I'm curious about the genre of the Chronica. You talked about this a little bit. It's something that doesn't have like a direct equivalent in English, right? We don't, it's a tradition of nonfiction that's different from the ones that we have here. Do you feel like there's any work that a translator needs to do in bringing a new genre to a new readership like that? Does that affect the choices that you make when you're translating, knowing that this is supposed to be, say, nonfiction rather than fiction, even though it's using literary devices and so on?
I hadn't actually thought of that in the process of translating
Mm,
these Crónicas, but something that I was thinking about recently is, and actually there is an element of this in the introduction to Wonderland, have to hold up. Because if you go back hundreds of years, the Crónica, if we're talking about the Americas, was something written by European invaders and colonizers documenting, their experiences and their observations from their perspective of the so-called New World, for the people back in the Old World. And it's definitely evolved over the many hundreds of years. And I think it's a little bit of almost like an umbrella term, because there's a lot of different forms that a Chronica could take. And just even within this book, Melanie, experiments a lot with form and has different types of text. And I think that maybe subconsciously when we decided to leave Crónicas in Spanish in the title, part of it was like, if you just say Chronicles, I don't know, it kind of reminds me too of Chronicles of a Death Foretold by Garcia Marquez, which, I don't know, just kind of not wanting to call that stereotype of like the boom generation of Latin American writers, but also I think in a way kind of leaves the reader open and curious, like what are these texts going to be? What does this contain? It's not a novel. Is it a memoir? And I think that's exactly even questions that Melanie and I would ask, like, what do we call this? Is this a memoir? Is it just a collection of essays? It's not, it's not like a series of examinations, like dry examinations of American culture or things like that. So, kind of just leaving it in Spanish allowed us to kind of leave that open window, to have different types of texts and experiment and kind of leave the reader's expectations open as well, in my opinion.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you so much. Um, uh, we are getting close to the end of the hour. I do want to give one last call out for questions from the audience in case anybody has any, either for me, for Emily, for Marianna, anything that's on your mind at all.
There was a question in the chat. Hi, I'm Mary. There was a
Oh,
question
hi.
in the chat by Michael Esparza that I also would love to hear more about. He asked about just elaborating more on the stigma of native translating your native language, not part of the translating community. So this is just a like learning, and that's something that I had no idea about and would love to hear touched on as well.
Sure, yeah. Is that Emily or Mars? Is that something either one of you would like to talk about? I can try to tackle it.
Sure, I could
myself
try and
if you
talk about it. I also want
Yeah.
to mention that someone in the chat had asked for sources that we'd referenced.
Mm.
And I think my reading came with the source. At least they put it in the comments, the translation and race. So maybe we can show that at some point. But regarding the stigma, it's the same. It's in the same vein as like an immigrant, which I'm one, being accused of not speaking good English. In the same vein, you get accused of being unable to write good English. And I think it's much more, I mean, it's hard to look at a translation and understand how well the person translating has grasped the source text. But you can, good English you can find if it's like sounds academic. And I think that it's a very much like a privilege question, I find often. Like, do you use as an immigrant the Oxford comma correctly? If not, perhaps you shouldn't translate into English. So I know it's very prevalent and it's changing now as certain translators working from their native or heritage languages are rising in the field, but it's still there.
Yeah, I definitely think for a long time there was a norm that a translator should be like a native English speaker who learned their source language as a second language, like studied it in college or something like that, and then comes in as, this person who can explain this exotic, incomprehensible foreign culture to civilized Americans. And I think that there's aspects of that approach that have hung around, I mean, that should never have been there in the first place and have definitely hung around for far too long. As a translator from Polish, I think it's also something that's been internalized abroad. As a native speaker of English, I get, I'm considered like a premium translator for folks in Poland to work with, and folks who are not native English speakers will sometimes get bypassed for work that they might be perfectly well capable of doing. And I would like to think that part of where we're getting to in the translation community is just understanding that these are two different ways of being a translator, and that also that there's a lot of overlap between them. It's not necessarily clear cut what a person's first or second language is. There's a lot of different ways of having relationships with a language. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is are you creating compelling pieces of literature, and I personally think that should really be the only measure that we're thinking about, or the main one anyway.
One quick addition, I know we're getting to the end.
Yeah, please.
I think also why there's space for new translations,
Yes.
older works, a lot of, I think it's hard to use the word mistakes or errors with translation, but I think, people have identified that strict model of, the kind of professorial figure who was, the kind of the gatekeeper, I guess, of certain works of literature from certain countries, authors, that there's definitely opportunities for people who have a different connection to the language to go back to those works and bring a new translation to life.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we have, how are we on time? We have literally 2 minutes. We have something coming up that Emily is going to talk to us a little about, if I can get to the right slide. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, this has been recently booked. So the Head in the Hand bookstore, which is here in Philadelphia, in North Philly, kind of Kensington area, they've invited Transversal to do another workshop, but in person. And since, we have all of you here, if any of you are based in Philly, if you're interested in doing something maybe more in depth, maybe with a practical component or exercises, or where you could bring a draft, it's still in the works. So, and I put my email here, which I'll also put in the chat, so that will be easier. But yeah, just wanted to tease that out there, and it would be great to have some of you if you want to explore it more.
And then we also have for you some links here to resources. Emily, I wonder if maybe you can share these links in the chat as well. I don't know if I can do it while I'm screen sharing, but you can learn more about the American Literary Translators Association at our shiny new website, which was just redesigned earlier this year, and I think looks really great. And I don't just say that because I work for them, at literarytranslators.org. A really wonderful article about the work of literary translation from the team over at the International Booker Prize. And then 5 great tips from the National Centre for Writing in the UK about getting started as a literary translator. But there's lots of wonderful resources to be found online. Emily mentioned the model contract at the Authors Guild for something that's a little bit more advanced level. There's a lot of other resources as well. And you can find any one of us by Googling, and at least, speaking personally, I'd be more than happy to answer folks' questions or direct them towards more resources. Okay, folks, I think we're right at the hour, so I think that's all that we've got time for. Thank you so much again to Emily Hunsberger and Marianna Suleymanova, and huge thanks to Blue Stoop for hosting us. Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday afternoon on a steamy hot day in July. I hope this was interesting, and I hope you're curious to learn more. And please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Sean, Emily, and Marianna, for sharing your wisdom with us today. Everyone who attended, if you enjoyed this session, please check out the links that they've shared and that event at the Head in the Hand if you are local to Philly. And if you would like to see more from Blue Stoop, like I said, we have plenty of free writing related and literary related programming going on. I've shared some links, including a feedback survey. Please fill out that feedback survey. That is for our panelists here, for our facilitators. If you enjoyed this today, you can let them know using that link, the Airtable link that I've added in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm going to stop recording.